Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 34. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Ylli Bajraktari, President and CEO of the Special Competitive Studies Project. Prior to launching SCSP, Ylli served as Executive Director of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Prior to joining NSCAI, he served as Chief of Staff to the National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, held a variety of leadership roles for former Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work, and served as Special Assistant to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey. Originally joining the Department of Defense in 2010, he served in the Office of the Undersecretary for Policy as a Country Director for Afghanistan and later India. Mr. Bajraktari is the recipient of Department of Defense Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, the highest award given to a career DoD civilian employee. Ylli, I want to welcome you to the China Desk, and let's jump in. With every one of our conversations, we like our audience to get to know a little bit about our guests. How you kind of came to this part of life where you're leading a special competitive study project probably wasn't what your elementary or middle school teacher asked you and you said, this is where I will end up years ahead in my life. But talk a little bit about what were some of the formative things in your upbringing and education that brought you into this subject matter.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast. We're big fans of your podcast here at SCSP, so it's really an honor and pleasure to be talking to you today. You raised a really good point because, we work in Washington, D.C., and every time I meet with interns or recent graduates, their first question is, how do you get to the top levels of our, government here in Washington as fast as possible? And I try to tell young people, especially, not that I'm really old, at least I don't consider myself that old yet, is that life is not linear, Steve. If you have planned a few of your steps, I've never planned any of my steps, which is also hard to explain to people in Washington because ultimately everybody thinks that there's a plan, there's like a step you undertake in Washington how to get to these jobs. I usually tell people two things: try to always work for good guys. That matters a lot in Washington. Because you will not have issues regarding your moral compass, how decisions are made, etc. So that's one thing. And the second thing that I usually tell young people is that things take time, and be prepared for the unknown. As I tell my team, like 5-6 years ago, I knew what artificial intelligence was, but even today, I would not claim that I'm an expert on AI. At least I know what they're talking about. But life takes you in really unpredictable territories, uncharted territories, and you have to embrace sometimes these challenges, learn and grow with them. The growth component probably is really important. You can tell from my accent, I was not born in the United States. I was born in Kosovo. In March 25 years ago, there was a big war that happened in that part of Europe that really probably shaped my worldviews. I think for the better, because I think I grew up in communism, and then we ended up in a really difficult period of wars and ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. And so the reason why probably drives me and motivates me to keep America as the leading world power is I saw firsthand, so like the actions of U.S. military in Kosovo. And if it wasn't for U.S. military, probably Albanians that I'm my ethnicity, probably they wouldn't be alive today. Certainly my family wouldn't be alive. So like every day there's a sense of like, especially in March, every time March comes, probably there's a sense of obligation and a sense of responsibility. I feel that me as an immigrant, I owe to this country, to the men and women in uniforms that sacrificed so much for that operation in Kosovo in 1999, which just seems so far. But these moments in life really shape who you are. They shape the worldviews. When you're young, You don't believe there is evil in the world, of course. Like we all believe that this is an immense opportunity to be alive, to be surrounded. But as you see now with events in Ukraine, with events in Israel, evil does exist, and you cannot be isolated forever or live in a bubble forever. So you have to be prepared. So I think those events maybe like shaped my worldviews and my drive to do what I do. And then, as I said, like once you start working for great leaders, once you start learning from them, once you start understanding what matters, I think you start finding your path. And along the way, you build a lot of friends. You build a lot of colleagues that you like and respect. On our team, we have people that we have been together for many, many jobs before. Because I just think that level of trust, that sense of mission, purpose, really brings us together. Whether it was NSCI or DoD or White House and now SCSP, I think we still stick together because we all believe in one mission, which I think is how do we ensure that our country, with the values and norms and everything we stand for, still continue to lead in the middle of all these challenges that are emerging, that have existed, and that we have to eventually confront.
Well, Ylli, I want to thank you for sharing all that. There's so much of that resonates with me, is consistent with my experience in some ways. Of course, I did not grow up in a conflict zone. Well, I did grow up in the greater DC area when there were race riots and things were on fire, but it was a very different kind of time and conflict. But I really appreciate you reminding people about that time, because almost everything pre 9/11 is a blank slate for a lot of people when they think about national security. The Cold War is a distant memory, and those things that happened between what we thought was the end of the Cold War and the 9/11 environment, it just sort of gets blurred out. So I think it's really, really important to remember. This is the China desk. There was a China role in all of that conflict too. There was an ill-timed bombing, and resulted in some questions and conflict. And I think you're exactly right that there's some lessons and feelings, experiences of that time that are echoing now, whether people remember. I think that's a real contribution to the conversation. But what you say about the Washington environment and growing up and trying to get a sense of where you go, really, you've given another version of the same story I've tried to share too. It gets caught in the Forrest Gump movie of whether it's the feather blowing in the wind or whether it's all predetermined. And boy, if when I was working at the Heritage Foundation in the 1990s, there was nothing in that could have predicted where my next steps would be. There were desires, but I think you gave a really remarkable summary of, yeah, find the people you like and you trust. Those may change over time, good for the good or bad, but just work hard, learn hard, have an open mind, grow and go, and take you a long way. I think the same can be said for looking at China generally, because facts change. How you think needs to grow with that. And I think that's kind of where I want to go with our conversation as we get into policy. But before we get into talking about policy, please talk a little bit about the Special Competitive Studies Project. What is the project? What are kind of your core missions? And from that, what brings us together in the scope of your project and talking about U.S.-China relations?
Yeah, of course, Steve. I mean, look, I believe that there were two driving forces that led us, with obviously support and guidance from Eric Schmidt, to launch Special Competitive Studies Project. The number one was when most of us worked at the AI Commission. I think that was like an eye-opening experience for all of us. On one end, it was an eye-opening experience because, you know, having spent 12 years in government, all of a sudden I was, confronted with a technology that is going to be transformative. And, like I'm a very skeptical person by nature, Steve. So like the first time you hear about AI, you go like, oh, maybe. But then every 6 months, I think, you see those things happening. You go like, oh, wow, this is really changing that fast. And this is, before we had the Chat GPT moments and all the moments that we're
Yeah.
currently living in. And so I think that was, I think, the first element in which we thought, oh wow, this is something different. It's probably once in a generation technology that's going to shape all aspects of our life and ultimately national security and the way we project power, the way we build our country and our economy. And I think the second piece was really the realization that our main competitor, China, understands the importance of this technology and they are investing. They have a vision about where they want to go with this technology. So when you put two and two together, like I thought the NSC background, um, the bipartisan energy probably that existed when we released the final report. Uh, um, for the audience that are listening and watching, we have about more than 50 pieces of legislation that came out of the NSCI report. And I think that is a testament of the bipartisan sentiment that exists, despite all the political noise you get daily um, regarding China and technology competition. So that is one piece of the element that we were like, oh, okay, we are in a different era now. Technology is playing a critical role in our competition with our main competitors. So it just happens that also technology is being developed outside of government. So how do you stay ahead as a country, as a government? How do you adopt policies that are current in this technology competition when a piece of this is being developed outside of government? As a reminder, like this is not a Cold War like situation because during the Cold War, most of the innovation happened in government labs. And so it was a much different era in which the government was able to put the testing, the evaluation, the deployment of these capabilities under a policy framework because they were all happening inside the government labs. This is a different era where technology innovation is happening outside of government and it's happening really fast. And it's also happening, in the ecosystem of our main competitor. And so we thought that there's an area in which needs um, it's an area in which you need to bring some kind of a bridge between the private sector and government. So
Mhm.
that's one piece of the SCSP. The second was, we were really compelled by the story of Dr. Kissinger of the project he led in the 50s called Special Studies Project, which was basically, you know, I don't want to make parallel, examples between now and the 50s, but when you look back in the 50s, we slowly start realizing that we face a serious competitor in Soviet Union, that they have really catch up with us in terms of the nuclear weapons, the size, and so like the scale of their nuclear weapons. That we were still living the glory days of World War II victory, and yet we have not grasped as a society, as a national security establishment. So like the importance of needing to think differently and needing to be organized differently against Soviet Union. And so when Eric and Dr. Kissinger were writing their book, The Age of AI, Dr. Kissinger spoke fondly about this initiative. Even towards the end of the book, he talks about the need to establish a body that looks at the AI implications on all aspects of our life, societal, economical, and national security. And then Eric came up with the idea of like really continuing the NSCI journey and rebranding it to look at more areas of our society, the economy, education, and some other areas of our society where more work needs to be done to accelerate adoption of AI and all the emerging technologies for national security reasons. Because as you know, Steve, this is a really important decade. I mean, the national security strategy called it a decisive decade in our competition with China. And I truly believe that. I believe the next couple of years are really fundamentally critical in how we organize and how we approach this competition. And I believe technology is at the center of competition.
Yeah, well, there seems to be a bit of jargon that comes up frequently in this kind of a conversation of techno-economic competition. A lot of times, if you're talking about strategic studies or things that get gone through in grad programs for multiple decades, and even things that Dr. Kissinger himself would have been talking about a lot. You'd have kind of geopolitics, you would have economic and trade policy, and technology kind of existed as a connective tissue in all these other areas. But a lot of what we read in your reports and things that have gone into like the Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the Chinese Communist Party and the U.S. House of Representatives, this idea of techno-economic competition, it's kind of putting together a silo, and that maybe that's not the perfect way to put it. That's different than the way we've thought about this in the past. So talk a little bit about whether my response or understanding of this is right track, wrong track, but how important is it that these two things are kind of grafted together in a ways are different from the old roadmap or silos of government and strategic thinking in the past?
No, that's a good point, Stephen. I remember once we were meeting with Representative Gallagher, which I'm a big fan, and I think the work he has done with the China Select Committee is tremendous. And when I was explaining to him, so like the road to how we got here, is that I was fortunate to work for General McMaster, as you know, and I think the National Security Strategy document of 2017 is probably going to be remembered in our history as probably one of the most important documents because it really turned the corner on how we view China.
Mm-hmm.
Up to that moment, like, even at the end of the Obama 2 administration, you can see the clear-eyed approach to like, this is not the China we were hoping it is. But I think the 2017 National Security Strategy that Dr. Nadia Shadlow drafted and General McMaster like steered the interagency process towards that document. It's an incredible document. But as I told Representative Gallagher, a big piece missing in that document is the technology piece.
Mm-hmm.
And there are reasons for that because our government is not organized when we produce these strategy documents to have a chapter on technology.
Yeah.
We have, bits and pieces here and there, promote and protect usually aspects in these documents, but there is not a clear chapter that says in the techno-economic space, we got to do the following. And so I thought the NSCI document really filled that gap because when you look at the 16 chapter we produced with the AI Commission, they're not just about AI. Yes, we were the AI Commission, but once you start peeling off layers of the change you need to do to stay ahead in AI, there are almost identical issues you have to solve, whether you need to do quantum or biotech or advanced manufacturing. They all have to do with hardware, how we are organized, resources needed, people, talent, the immigration policies. They're all things that we have to change or probably accelerate in order for us to stay ahead in this techno-economic competition. And so that's how we stepped into that space with the NSCI document, because we produced a document that I would call it for that time was the techno strategy document with AI, so like the anchor for all these changes that we need. And then you saw, for example, I think chapter 5, if I'm not mistaken, is the hardware chapter in which we talk about all the things that ended up being in the CHIPS Act, which,
Mm-hmm.
had enormous bipartisan support, once in a generation, probably legislation to infuse resources into, jumpstarting domestic capabilities and something that we all realized is so important in our competition with China. And so that's how I view how the techno-economic conversation has moved from like being on the margins to like moving more and more into a center national security space.
Yeah, I think it's just a very, very important concept in national security strategies before the one that you played a part in. There was very frequent, whether it's Pentagon reports or a White House report, there would be talk about revolution and military affairs kind of thinking. But we didn't really have the personnel knowledge and strategic thinking about revolution and technological affairs and how that actually trumps in some ways what's happening in the military, in education, in all these parts of life. And we sort of thought about classical threats. about potential invasions, terrorist attacks, things like that. All important, all still relevant, but not really capturing what a whole of society kind of threat might be and how we need to organize to meet that threat, but also how we need to organize to just improve ourselves and our own processes to rise to the challenge. I think that is kind of bread and butter about what we try to talk about at the China desk. And I'd like to just pursue this a little bit more. When we think of this kind of technological competition, I'm mindful of one of the ideas that I remember being talked about in the last administration's State Department economic shop about moving toward clean networks and clean supply chains. And I think those core concepts still remain. But how does that kind of inform how we think about AI and just technology more broadly in an environment that I would describe as a new Cold War under some different circumstances, different scope perhaps? But it's similar as you were describing the 1950s. Our competition or our enemy had already kind of declared this Cold War on us, was already engaged in economic, scientific, and other forms of organization to best us. And I would wager that through the periods of pursuit of a strategic stakeholder in the People's Republic of China, that its government played nice with us, but was still pursuing all of these things that are now playing out. And we're just wising up to it and figuring out how to respond. But we can just come back to that basic notion. If I'm right about the environment we find ourselves in, and that we need to build upon and reorganize ourselves, and how do we interact with the People's Republic of China? You know, as well as I, where we have been and where that's left us, with high degrees of dependency, high degrees of integration, both internationally and here in the United States. But given the challenges that we face and the competition we're in, how should we be thinking about a different form of engagement, association, or whatever words you would use to describe it, whether it's decoupling, minimizing risk, all those things get talked about these days.
Yeah. No, Steve. I mean, you raise a really good point. I mean, again, not using the historical analogies, but like first, let me talk about how we have to change, because I think, we are changing. My biggest worry is that, do we understand the sense of urgency, and are our actions really reflective of that urgency? So we usually at the SCSP we say that after the end of World War II, the security became the main domain of competition against Soviet Union. And therefore, we created the National Security Council at the White House, which I was proud to serve, because Soviet Union was never a threat on any other domain. It was only on the security, on the security piece. After the end of the Cold War, the globalization, the global economy, integrated free market became the notions of driving, the international order, I would say. And so we created at the White House the National Economic Council, because we thought that is the driving force for global good, and therefore we need to be organized for that. After the tragic events of 9/11, we created another office at the White House that dealt specifically with the CT-related issues. What we have argued first with the AI Commission and also with the SCSP is we need the change to happen from the top. And if you and I are arguing that we are in the techno-economic competition, more on the techno than economic, with AI and all these emerging technologies really providing you the early glimpse of the future, then we need to be organized for that future. And we have argued really strongly with the Commission and now with the SCSP that you need a Technology Competitiveness Council. We modeled this on the Space Council that exists at the White House. If we didn't create in the 50s and 60s the Space Council at the White House, we would have never had the space as we know it today. We would have never gone to the moon. But that worked because the Space Council existed at the White House and usually the council is chaired by the vice president.
Mm-hmm.
And so our argument has been that if we all believe that we are in the techno-economic competition with China, and that AI and all the other constellations of these emerging technologies are that battlefield, then we need to be organized differently, and we need to create maybe a new council at the White House that brings together all the stakeholders. And why I argue about this is, number one is, if you look back of how we all dropped the ball on the 5G situation, is that no office owned the 5G portfolio.
Yeah.
Almost everybody had a piece of 5G, whether it was from national security reasons, you had the National Security Council. When you had, for the economic purposes, you had the National Economic Council. If you had the S&T piece, it was the OSTP. But I think that lack of organization, that lack of ownership of one particular issue that is so fundamentally critical for the future of telecommunication, the communication, the C2, all the elements of how we get data, use data of the future, I think we dropped the ball there because we were not organized for today's competition. And I think organizing ourselves differently at the White House first would make a difference. The second piece is how departments and agencies are organized. And as you know, as we have said it many, many times, there are always islands of hopes in each of these departments. But are these projects scaled? Do these individuals and these offices have the necessary resources and the necessary policy backing by their leaders to scale it? That's kind of a 50-50 in my mind. I think we all understand that we need to do more. I think the leadership, rhetoric, and policy guidance are in the right place. But as you know, this needs constant overseeing. It needs constant push so the bureaucracy moves. I believe when United States moves, that has a huge impact. And so I think we are in that cross period now in which I think AI has really dominated the policy circle since ChatGPT.
Yeah.
The President's AI EO, the ongoing AI Insight forums organized in a bipartisan fashion on the Senate side, the EU AI Act that was adopted, they all showcase that everybody understands that this is a transformative technology. It's once in a generation. It's going to bring a lot of opportunities, but it's also going to inherently bring a lot of challenges like every new technology. And we have to move or be organized and dedicate specific resources. To your latter question about China, I think, as I've put it for the NSCI, we have to put our house in order first and realize that we have some weaknesses that we have to improve. And I think the CHIPS Act is probably the one piece of legislation that probably tried to address those weaknesses, which was the hardware. Because over the years, we have outsourced, manufacturing of these like critical semiconductors to Taiwan, which is 110 miles away from our main competitor. And so I think the first step was really, which started with the previous administration and continued with this administration, is like, how do we build domestic capabilities? So we build sufficient independence from China on these critical technologies, especially on the hardware side. And the second piece is, how do we protect what we have that China doesn't take it, either steal it through the IP theft, through third-party actors, and use these technologies, use these capabilities to get ahead in this technology space. If you look at the electricity, if you look at any industrial revolution that has happened based on these technologies, that country that adopted and moved out in these technologies, that country created wealth and prosperity for its citizens. It set the standards for the international order and how everybody else uses these technologies. It set a set of alliances and partnerships on using together these capabilities and these technologies. And ultimately, we're able to build military to address any threats that were pertinent to the current era, not the previous era.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of things that this sort of provokes in my mind about how we do what we do and what our way forward is. And I always have to be careful for my wish not to be the father of my thought, because I have a particular point of view about the Communist Party of China. I have particular experiences in dealing with them that don't make me a fan, and I might be more skeptical than the average person. But at the same time, the environment you describe tells me that no matter what someone's experience is, we cannot succeed in getting our house in order while still just dealing with everyone the same way around the world. That's kind of what the era of globalization was coming out of the Cold War. It was the end of history, and sort of there were these forces operating on autopilot, and it was as if they, like magic, were going to transform others to abide by rules, norms, and standards. And there was something inherent in these technologies that would be liberating. And for sure, there are positive prospects in all of these forms of technology, but there are still evil people who can use these technologies for less enlightened purposes. And so as we think about how we organize ourselves, I would just ask the simple question, can we have normal relations with the People's Republic of China if what we really need to do is to get our house in order and be able to meet and exceed this competitive challenge that is not just national security. We need to have an energy grid that can produce enough power reliably and at low enough cost in order to be a technological superpower that is innovative and resilient. We need to have an education system that focuses on generating the kind of thinking and skills that can populate and operate this kind of an advanced technological economy and country. And we need people that can be recruited into government that don't just, maybe like me, sit back and have an opinion about what they read, but actually know and use these technologies, that might be of an engineering background, might have some of these greater skills, where the globalized approach to immigration and education was an ideal that a lot of us feel good about. But I think in each of these areas, as your work already has begun to scratch, we kind of have to think and act differently. So talk a little bit about how do we interact with the People's Republic of China as we go through this process. We at the China Desk talk about a principle of reciprocity as kind of a starting point. What we can't do there, their entities shouldn't be able to do here. It's not perfect, but it's kind of a notional ideal that sort of sets the terms. And when we think of, say, a power like Japan or cooperative allies in other parts of the world, there's a lot that we can do in their countries, and we're less concerned about what they're going to do in ours. But the People's Republic is different. So talk a little bit about what kind of some of the building blocks of how to think about that interaction. Does reciprocity play an interesting or unique role? Are there other concepts that you think should be front of mind as people think about defining the way forward and dealing with this consequential power that's going to have an impact on our lives?
No, Steve, I think you raised a really good point, and we talk about this in a number of our publications. One of the examples, to just piggyback on your reciprocity, is we've been pretty vocal in terms of TikTok, for example, because our argument has been, number one is how did we get to the point of allowing, our main competitors' social media platform to have unimpeded access among our citizens. And so this is not just an economic competitor. This is a competitor across all domains, especially military, security. Their goals and ambitions about Taiwan, about Southeast Asia, have been pretty clear. Their goals about AI have been pretty clear. I mean, they want to be global AI power by 2030. Their strategy about Made in China 2025 have been pretty transparent and, open out there. So this is not the China. I like to say that this is. I read their documents as they're written. I mean, because I think at the end of the day, these are government documents, strategy documents that ultimately have to be implemented. And there are enormous resources behind these strategy documents, which we have seen, in how they have deployed 5G globally, how they pick their national AI champions and deploy them globally. And we can see now what's happening with the electric vehicles. Like all of a sudden, within like less than 2 years, China, because of the speed and scale and government subsidies, can deploy enormous numbers of vehicles and become the largest exporter of EVs globally, surpassing our main allies, as you mentioned, Japan, for example. And so this is a serious competitor, which, to the point of TikTok, how did we allow to get to this point? While at the same time, to your argument about reciprocity, none of our social media platforms can operate inside China.
Right.
So we have said time and again that based on two arguments. Now, one is national security argument. TikTok should not be allowed to operate the way it has operated in the United States. And the second argument is reciprocity, because we have seen year after year China chasing out our companies in different waves: technology companies, consulting companies, manufacturing companies. At the point when they had enough IP theft, they were able to build domestic capability, and they were able to scale it and export it globally. And so we have not only raised the flag about TikTok, but there's a set of platforms coming out of China, whether it's in retailing, whether it's in online payment systems, that possess a serious threat for the future, because they're building a global platform coverage, where they're deploying platforms that we will use to buy, sell, pay, use, drive at any given moment. And if this is the economy of the future, then, as we said in our mid-decade challenge report of September of 2022, you might easily wake up in 2025, 2030 timeframe, and everything you do in your cell phone was either built in China, your data is routed through China, and you're using modems and antennas and digital infrastructure made in China. And that is the future that I think none of us want, especially people living in the democratic world. And I think kind of awareness raising about this threat is what's needed first and foremost here domestically in the United States, because I think we don't think much about where the products are coming from. When you buy a modem for your home, you don't think if that modem is made in China or where it was built. I mean, you just need a modem and you go to the closest store. When you want to buy a drone, like most of the market is dominated by Chinese products. And that when you buy that drone for family, recreational purposes or whatever you want to use it for, you still need to download the Chinese app on your phone to operate that drone. And not many people think that where that data is going through, what is that data used on the back end. And so this is sort of like the future that we're living right now, that is being built. And I think our purpose as SCSP is, number one, is like really painting that picture of like what would happen when all elements of our digital life is one way or another controlled by Beijing. That's one. Or if you fall behind in manufacturing and producing and staying ahead in these global technology battle of platforms.
Yeah, well, it's a potentially scary future. I wish it was just an exercise in creative nonfiction, because it is going to take a lot to deal with these kinds of challenges. And one of the things we've tried to address in several conversations is the importance of who actually sets standards and how are they honored and enforced. And when we look at where our supply chains have gone and our areas of dependency have grown, they have conspicuously gone into a system where there isn't transparency and accountability, where there isn't respect for human dignity. There is no notion of privacy in China. There is no sense of protecting the individual, freedom of thought and expression, or anything remotely like ethics. And as we learned with COVID, we also know that there isn't a tradition and foundation of quality control. And so if it was a problem on public health, imagine how that multiplies if you have AI bots and programs just logarithmically multiplying the operations that they can engage in. It's not like old school clandestine operations where someone is listening in on someone real time. You are mopping up terabits upon millions of terabits of data and applying these machines to be able to unleash lifetimes of human intellect to try to discern patterns, strategies for manipulation, and everything from outages to I don't want an outage, I just want to control how people think. and and so I mean, to me, there is a whole different horizon of possibilities that is dark. But I don't want to kind of wind down our conversation on the darkness, because I think a lot of your work is informed by a healthy optimism that with the right organization, with the right sense of urgency, with the right communications and leadership, we can rise to and overcome this challenge, and we should. So if you could, in our final minutes, talk a little bit about what are some of the events or publications that you have on the horizon that are looking at driving this conversation forward into what we can and should do. Just assuming we've already hit the sobriety checkpoint and had kind of our oh crap moment, and now where do we go?
No, Steve, I subscribe to a lot of what you said in your comments. Um, I think we should not lose sight that this is still, the leading economy, the leading country for the best universities in the world, where we still attract the most talented individuals around the world to come study here, and most of them want to stay here. I think we just have to find a way for keeping them here. As an immigrant, I'm biased about this thing because I understand the big immigration debate in the United States. I really do. But I really think that there's a huge opportunity for a lot of people who come here, who want to live here and contribute to our country, to keep them here because they're really talented. They went to and they studied and they worked hard in some of the best universities in the world on some of the most critical technologies that we just discussed today. So why not keeping them, right? And so I think we should create a pathway for those individuals. As I said, we still have the best technology companies in the world. If you look at the last couple of years, the two proudest moments probably for our country is that the COVID vaccine came out of our labs. Whether it was the DARPA program from a couple of years ago, but how we were able to speed vaccination and scale up that capability is that what allowed us to continue with our life as soon as we could. And it wasn't out of Chinese labs, it wasn't out of Russian labs or North Korean labs. It was out of United States companies. And so I think that should be viewed as a proud moment of technology and innovation and health coming from this country. And the second piece is ChatGPT, which I think since the release of ChatGPT, all the leading US companies have been at the forefront of AI, while China is still struggling to find their path in this generative AI moment, right? So we still are leading in this space. We still have a lot of elements that we lead. I think the one space that I think we walk in as a SCSP is really how do you increase that public-private collaboration? Because over the years, if you think about the Cold War, innovation happened in government labs. Then after the Cold War, it moves in private sector. And I think in the 2020s, we have to find a way to bring these two communities together. Because in one end, innovation is happening in private sector, but also on the other end, we need government to take charge and update almost all aspects of governance for the age we live in. And I think you can't do that without public-private partnership. And so to your point about what we're doing is we're organizing the first AI Expo in Washington, D.C. at the convention center, where the goal is really to bring small, medium-sized companies or government agencies to meet and talk to each other, to see these capabilities, and then whether or not that continues with some kind of a contractual relationship, that's beyond our control. But I think we're looking at the biggest space in Washington where we expect thousands of people walking, chatting, enjoying discussions with over 85 conversations and panels and fireside chats over the course of 2 days from May 7th and 8th here in Washington, D.C. So that is what we are trying to bring to this competition by really removing that gap that exists between public and private sector in our country.
Well, that's a fantastic opportunity, and thank you for sharing with the audience how they might participate in that. Now, Ylli, before we exit our conversation, we share with the audience how best do they connect with you and follow your work.
Thank you, Steve. So we have an incredible website, scsp.ai. So scsp.ai, and you can follow us on traditional LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. But all the information about the expo right now is going through the website. You can register to attend for free. And then if you're a company, you want to exhibit, there are options there to enlist yourself and come and showcase what you have to offer, to our nation in terms of this AI and other emerging technologies.
Excellent. Well, to our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. Thank you very much for joining, and a special thank you to Ylli Bajraktari for sharing his perspective. And until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media streams.